Mm.
Welcome to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the authors that bring them to us. Before we get started, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and start with you, Patrick.
Hi, I'm Patrick Dugan. I'm the author of the Darkest Storm trilogy, as well as the Watchers of Asteria series through Distracted Dragon Press.
All right. Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Lavin Leverett. I'm the author of the Icefog Chronicles and the book series I'm talking about today, a medieval paranormal romance series, The Wolf and the Nun.
All right. And Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I'm the author of the Boar King's Honor trilogy from Falstaff Books. And with Jeannie Adams, I co-write science fiction, the Outcast Station science fiction mystery series. And I also write romantic suspense, which is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight.
All right, perfect. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Emily. Tell us about your new release and where the idea for the book, or in this case, series, came from.
Sure. The new book is called The Enchanted Rose. It's the second in the series. It comes from the medieval nun, 12th century, named Marie de France. So it's actually based on a real person and her stories. And so I take her romances, which are in this context, for her, stories of knights and ladies and magic and stuff that don't necessarily have love stories or sex in them, and turn them into modern romances, which pretty much follow the modern definition of romances with knights and magic and stuff in them. But it's about her, a nun, and a count who turns into a wolf 3 days a week. That's a curse he has, and it comes straight from a story of hers called Biscleret. And she was thought, as far as we know, to have written the first sentient werewolf in English. That is a guy who turns into a wolf but doesn't go crazy when he's a wolf. He's still a man, he's just in a wolf body. And so in the first book, the two meet and deal with a demon. And in the second book, they have parted ways to deal with the demonic problem separately. And so this is watching Claret go to France, and Marie goes to Kells to research her mother's magic. And by the end, both of them are in slightly more precarious situations than they started.
And why did you pick her?
I love her stories. I've always loved her stories. I mean, my PhD is in medieval English, and I studied that, wrote my dissertation not on her, but on romances. And I love writing medieval and medieval inspired stuff. And her stories are delightful because she's a woman writing in the Middle Ages in the 12th century. She's incredibly, incredibly well educated. She had to have known Latin and French and English. And actually, she wrote in French, but she's an English author because she lived in England. And so, but it was at the time when everybody who was anybody in England spoke French.
Nancy, how about yours?
Mine is called Worth the Wait, and it's an installment in my Arachnid Files romantic suspense series. The agents in this series work for a multinational covert organization called Arachnid, after the spider figure in Greek mythology, because spinning webs, intrigue. And Arachnid was created by all these nations to go around the rules. And so they handle cases that your standard law enforcement agencies, for whatever reason, would have difficulty with. That leads to some tension with law enforcement, who kind of resent the ability of these other people to go around the rules, and some tension with Arachnid because conventional law enforcement usually gets the credit for what they've done. So that's the background to the series. The hero of this particular book is an agent who has done a number of raids on child traffickers, and he's burnt out, and his boss sends him home for a vacation. And so he's in the small town east of Raleigh, North Carolina, where he grew up, and he meets the heroine, who's a deputy sheriff there, and she was the younger sister of his high school girlfriend. And there was always a spark between them, but neither one of them ever did anything about it because honorable people. Yet now her sister's been killed in an accident. She's raising her sister's child. And as they spend time together with mutual friends, the heroine begins to notice disturbing resemblances between the hero and the child. And her sister never said who the child's father was. It is actually a secret baby, which is a form of story that I generally despise, because I think there's very little justification for keeping something like that secret. But the person who kept it a secret is gone. And so everyone else is just dealing with the fallout. And it was inspired by my friend Karen Crane, who said, why don't we write some stories with a DNA test in them? And secret babies are perfectly set up for DNA testing. So she and another author, Jeannie Adams, and I put out these 3 stories as an anthology centering on DNA tests and kept it up for about a year. But we took the anthology down, and now I've tweaked the story a little bit and re-released it as an individual story. It's a novella, not a novel.
All right, perfect. Patrick.
So Cogs and Conjuring is my newest book. So it started because on a dare I wrote Fate and Flux because somebody said, hey, write steampunk. And I said, I can do that. So I wrote the first one, meant to be a standalone, and then everybody was like, when's the next one? And I'm like, there is no next one. They were like, no, there has to be a next one. So you meet Quinn, who is the main character from Fate and Flux, which is pretty much a prequel to the series. So Quinn is a one-armed blacksmith who is also a watcher of Asteria, and he, at the end, don't want to go that way, but he ends up with getting all sorts of different adventures thrown at him, and he has to master not only, losing an arm, but using his blacksmithing skills and other stuff to protect Asteria from all the outside influences that are trying to destroy the country.
All right, perfect. The next question, I'll start with you, Nancy. What's something about being a published author that surprises you?
How much promotion you need to do. I'm a person who could not sell toothbrushes to benefit the marching band in my hometown. So I've had to learn this from the ground up, and I'm still learning it. I wouldn't say that I've figured it out yet, but I'm getting better at it, I hope. But I really did not expect the degree to which author involvement in promotion is necessary.
All right. Patrick?
What she said. Which is definitely the marketing really takes you off guard when you first start, because you just figure people will buy your books. The one thing that really shocked me was just how gracious people are. When you're sitting at your table and somebody runs up to tell you how much they loved your book, or that they they were having a bad time and they lost themselves in your story and it helped them. So that always is just a really nice part of being an author, is interfacing with people who actually read your stuff.
All right. Emily?
Well, for me, it's a bit about, because I'm new to writing romance. I also, honestly, when I was a kid, I've talked to a lot of authors who have been writers since they were like 5, right? And I never really thought I would be. I really enjoyed it. I just never thought I would be good enough to do it. And I figured out I was wrong about that, which was nifty. But the biggest surprise for me has been writing romance. I never thought I would write romance for a number of reasons, including I didn't really think that I could write sex scenes, and it turns out I can, but they are basically just action scenes that make you blush, right? Because it's all about movement and where people are, and wait, can he really do that with that hand, or is that somewhere else, so it's not really possible? Like, so they're pretty much just that, and you approach them that way, they're a little easier. But I know that for many years I was awful close-minded about romance, And I think if I went back and looked at myself at 18 and said, hey, you know, when you're in your 40s, you're going to write romance, I'd have just had an absolute, my 18-year-old self would have had an absolute breakdown and been like, what happened to you? I thought you were a feminist, you know, down the line. And now I really deeply understand how feminist a genre romance is. And I mean, that is a part of why I also like using Marie de France, because she's a woman who wrote them in her own time. And, you know, so that for me has been a lot of the surprise, that this sort of poo-poo genre, that I realized that the poo-pooing was part of the patriarchy, not that rejecting it was feminist. Like I had to switch my perspective on that.
All right, perfect. So next question, Patrick, what did you do to research for this book?
A lot of it was going back to the original source material because I hadn't planned on writing any more in the series. So a lot of it was trying to figure out, like, you know, luckily I didn't do anything stupid like, you know, kill off the character thing in the first book or something, you know. So it was a lot of digging around and making sure that the story, you could pick up either book and read it first and it didn't matter. So that was a lot of what I did. You know, when you're writing steampunk, you're making stuff up. So there's not as much research as there is in, like, with Emily's book.
All right, and then that goes straight back to you, Emily.
I always love this question because I get to give this answer. How did I do the research for this? I made my students read them in class so that I could spend time on them. I teach a medieval literature class, and so we just read a lot of Marie de France because she's important in that too. So that was kind of fun. But the thing that I run up against is the question of authenticity, right? Like how much is going to be real, right? Because I mean, like, the guy turns into a wolf, so we're already past the realism territory there. But you know, there's a lot of questions, especially with medieval and Renaissance, and I'm sure Nancy could speak to this because she writes in the era of Richard III too. Like, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, how accurate are you supposed to be, and what does accuracy and authenticity mean? And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and actually that's a part of the scholarship I'm doing now, is talking about, is like, as a writer of fiction, how do I think about the Middle Ages in a way that I put them in my stories? And I've ultimately come down to, it's my Middle Ages and my story. And so, you know, when I do research, I find out the stuff that's true and take what I want and then put my own stuff in as well. Like, that's what I do. But I think with research, that's one of the questions that people who write historical stuff get to grapple with a lot, because it's not just who was where when, but like, what do you include and how do you include it, and in those sorts of questions.
Yeah. Nancy.
I actually did not have to do a lot of research for this because it's set in contemporary North Carolina. I looked up online information about DNA testing and how it works and how the results are expressed. But that was the main thing, because I'd already done research into weapons and body armor and things of that sort for earlier books in the series. So all I had to do was recycle what I had done before. And, you know, as Emily said, when you're writing a historical, it's complicated because you have to make these choices that she mentioned. And when it's a historical fantasy, I find myself going back to the earlier books to say, okay, how exactly did I say this form of magic worked? Which is, you know, I have a series Bible, but I also like to just go back to the books. So, you know, I grew up in a small town, so I know how people behave in small towns. I grew up in North Carolina, so I know how people in North Carolina, what the focus is, although I did not write it in basketball season, which would otherwise be the focus of many people in North Carolina. So I really didn't have to do a lot of research, and I write other things that are research heavy, so it was kind of a pleasure not to have to go through all that for this.
All right, perfect. So the next question, Emily, was there any part of the process with this book that took you out of your comfort zone, and how did it impact you?
Yes, there was. There was really, that surprised me, a sex scene that popped up between my main character Marie and Triamore, who is the fairy queen. And again, this is though in Marie's version of the story that I'm using, the woman is unnamed. In a later version, an author gives her the name Triamore. And I was not expecting that at all. And I don't actually know that my editor was either. And the full sex scene did not end up in the final version for very good plot reasons, but that was new because I certainly had never written one between two people of the same gender before. And I was not expecting it to come up in the plot either. It made sense when it did, but that was startling and a new experience for me.
All right, Nancy.
It was the secret baby story, because every genre has its tropes, and there are romance readers who adore the secret baby story. But like I said earlier, I have real problems with the whole concept. And so I plotted this story and I was working on it. And at that time, the heroine knew that the hero was the baby's father, and she was falling in love with him, but not telling him the truth. And I was having all this cognitive dissonance about trying to write this story, because she's doing something scuzzy. And obviously she knows he's a great guy, or she wouldn't be falling in love with him. And the child needs a father. And I thought my head was going to explode at one point. And I called a friend of mine and I went, "This book is a secret baby story." And she said, there was this little silence, and she went, "And?" It was like, I'm the only person who didn't think of it as a secret baby story. And once I framed it that way, I realized what my problem with it was. And I could go back and rework the plot so that the secret had died with the mother and no one else was keeping a secret, because I just couldn't see how this woman could fall in love with this guy and yet not tell him that the child she's raising is his child. So, everybody else was like, "Well, of course it's a secret baby story. What did you think it was?" And I said, "Well, I thought it was a story about a woman raising her sister's child and reconnecting with a guy she had a crush on." And she went, "With a secret baby." So, it was not my brightest moment. I was not the brightest bulb on the tree when we came to that. But once that part got figured out and nailed, it was okay. But until then, I was like the hamster on the wheel, just running around and getting nowhere. So it was really nice to feel that story move forward and actually reach a resolution.
All right, Patrick.
So Cogs is the current unpleasantness baby. And so, I started this and had it finished, and my editor had it and gave it back to me, and then the world fell apart. And so it just took forever for me just to get my mind in the right frame to continue to work on a fantasy story, with everything else was so distracting. So that was really the writing of the book was, the same as it always is as far as the mechanics, but it was really challenging to try to be creative and inventive when you're just every 10 seconds there's something else going on that's taking your focus away.
All right, Nancy, how does being a writer impact you as a reader, and vice versa?
It's a lot harder for me to get totally lost in the pages of a book than it used to be. I'm always noticing things about the story, about the way it's put together, about how the character conflict is expressed, and it's frustrating. So I'm better at it than I used to be with picking up a book and just reading it. But it's been hard to get to that point. And reading has affected me as a writer because it's helped me figure out what I'll put the book down for. We all have different breaking points with a book where we go, "You know what, I'm just done." And figuring out what those points were has helped me, I hope, not write scenes like that will make readers like me go, "Really? Seriously? I'm done here." Because you don't want people to do that, because they won't finish this book and they won't buy the next book, and that's not good for your career. So reading and developing reading tastes has kind of helped me be more sensitive to certain issues as a writer.
Patrick?
I think I agree with Nancy. I've actually gone to audiobooks more and more because I find it easier to just enjoy the story, as opposed to when you're sitting and you're reading, it's very easy to start getting into, well, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and oh, wait a minute, that you shouldn't have done that. That should have been, you start, tearing it apart, because it's like, oh, but with the audiobooks, especially with a great narrator, and I think like the Murderbot Diaries, the narrator does a fantastic job, and you completely get lost in the story because somebody's reading it to you, as opposed to you're not sitting there looking at the words going, wait a minute, there's a typo there, oops, there's, or whatever you're noticing. But as far as how reading has affected me as a writer, I think that, I read stuff. So I love the show Leverage and Six of Crows from Lee Bardugo, which is now Shadow and Bone on Netflix. And I absolutely just love those books to the point where I was like, I can do this. So I ended up, I spent some time and figured it out. And so I ended up writing a cyberpunk heist books with fairies. So, because I wanted to do something that I absolutely love and wanted people who have similar tastes to really have another book to read that's just like, oh, this is awesome. It's another heist book, like these, so I think that when you find books that really move you, it sometimes makes you want to jump in to the pool and not write the exact same thing, but at least, an homage to the books you love.
All right. Emily?
For a long while, I didn't read as much fiction. I got in a kick where I was actually interested in biography / autobiography / memoir in two divergent areas. I read a lot of hockey biographies because I'm a big Carolina Hurricanes fan, and just reading stuff that was, fairly obviously ghostwritten, but written by former players and things like that, were just really fascinating. Gordie Howe's is great. And then I also read several from a lot of comedians, particularly female comedians, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Tiffany, what is her last name? Anyway, darn it, I can't. Haddish, there it is, Tiffany Haddish. And they were just really fascinating. And what I learned, especially from people like Amy Poehler and Tina Fey, was a lot about how they did improv comedy and the creation of things like comedy sketches, and the whole idea of yes and, that is, somebody says something and your response is never no, it's always yes and in a skit, and to do things like that. And since I write the Ice Flood Chronicles with someone else, with Sarah Adams, I realized that is what we did without knowing the names for it. So that has been interesting, was to sort of to see how that functioned in another place. More recently, I read a lot of romance, because if I was going to write it, I should have read it. And so I read a lot of it. And I think, and at least my editor thinks, and I agree, that romance is possibly slightly more heavy on the beats than a lot of genres are. There are a certain set of expectations that are fairly inflexible in a lot of ways. If you are promising a happily ever after romance and you don't do that, they'll come out with pitchforks and torches. It won't go well. So that helped a lot too. But I think I have the same problem that Nancy does. I read stuff and I am as interested in the mechanics of how it's done as I am in the story. And I learned a long time ago that when I go to movies, I have to keep my mouth shut, because people get really irritated when 15 minutes in you go, oh, that's the bad guy, and here are the things that are going to happen. And they just look at you and so, because that's the other hazard, is there are only so many ways that things go. And after you've read a lot, you sort of can see where things are going to go.
Perfect. So the next question, Patrick, what do you hope people take away from reading your story?
I hope they enjoy it. I really, I think the characters in the book are really just fun. It's a good adventure. It doesn't take itself uber seriously. It's, you know, steampunk mixed with magic. So there's a lot of, you know, there's a snarky robot butler and, dad joke telling alchemist and, all sorts of, just interesting little tidbits there. So, it's an enjoyable book. I feel like it's a short read, so it's fast. So I'm really hoping that when people sit down, they're like, okay, I just want more of these.
All right. Emily?
Yeah, what Patrick said. I don't know that there's any author that's like, I hope people are miserable when they're done. I really hope that like they read it. And mine are also their novellas. And so I do hope, people can read them fairly quickly. And I hope that they will want to read more. But I do hope that when they read them, they get a sense of broadness from the Middle Ages, that it wasn't all fire and rape, that there were other things in the Middle Ages that were happening as well, that it wasn't a dark ages, that it was a time of art and literature and beauty and all of those things. I do hope that they like my characters as much, or at least as close to as much as I like them. And they are lighter books. There is a lot of, I wouldn't say it's comedy, except in this sort of, it never is good to compare yourself to Shakespeare, but I've always loved Beatrice and Benedict. And so that's a kind of dynamic that I was hoping for, that out of like Much Ado About Nothing, this seems sort of verbal banter and stuff like that. So I hope people find that interesting. I also touch on a few serious things. Claveret, the main character plays Claveret, is a Crusade veteran and is both physically and emotionally scarred from his time there, and coming back was not an easy transition for him, in part because he picked up the wolf 3 days a week thing on Crusade and brought it back. Some people bring back like vases and rugs, and he brings back, a wolf 3 days a week. So that's part of what he's negotiating, but that I touch on the fact that those things have lasting consequences.
All right. Nancy?
I hope people will get an escape from whatever's on their plate from day to day from it. I mean, I agree with everything that Patrick and Emily said, basically. But I put in some action adventure because I like action adventure. And I hope they'll find the love scenes satisfying and touching. And, as Emily was saying, a love scene has to be done right, or she didn't say this, but this is what I would extend her argument. If it's not done right, it's just stupid and annoying. And so it has to have emotional content as well as being moving in a physical sense. And so I hope people have enjoyed that and think that I did that okay. And at the end of it, they are satisfied and are happy with the ending because it's a romance and happily ever after.
All right. So now that we've gone through a year and a half of figuring out what normal will be again, start with you, Emily. Tell us a little bit about your normal routine for writing.
Because I teach, I didn't get as far afield from normal as a lot of people did. My school managed to keep kids on campus all fall and all spring. We never had to send anybody home. We never had to do that. I will go ahead, I don't often, but I will plug Methodist University for that. We managed to safely do it. And so, 3 days a week I went in and taught class. I also had class, half hybrid and things like that. And that was very different. But my the school semester has an arc stayed more similar. I would say one of the big changes in how I dealt with things is I would usually take 1 day a week to write. And that would happen in the quiet of my office at home. But my husband was work from home, and actually tomorrow was his first day back in the office. And so quiet, 1,600 square foot townhouse, not a lot of quiet if somebody's making noise. And so there was some adjustment in how we deal with those sorts of things, because he is I like to have a TV on in the background when I work. And I'm like, if I'm not somewhere so noisy I can't hear anything, I don't want any noise at all. And so there was a negotiation there. So getting back to normal, like I actually I am going to miss him tomorrow and miss knowing that he is downstairs, you know, and I can share something and go down. So getting back to his kind of normal, I think for me is going to be the difference, as opposed to anything that sort of affects my writing life, because I was pretty much able to keep the same schedule as I ever have.
All right. Nancy.
Libraries are available again. When I wrote my last historical fantasy, I used a lot of interlibrary loan books about the Battle of Waterloo, because I knew nothing about the Battle of Waterloo except who won. And that's really not enough if you're going to write about it. Even if the book is not about that, if you're going to put it in the book, you got to talk about it in some specificity. So when libraries closed down, that was a problem. And so I'm really glad to be able to get an interlibrary loan slip and get a book that has information I need in it, instead of trying to find a cheap used copy because the library wasn't out there. So that's the main thing. But the other thing is that even though I work at home, I'm in the habit of every once in a while being able to call somebody and say, hey, let's meet for lunch, or hey, let's go get a cup of overpriced coffee and talk about what we're working on. And I got adjusted to not being able to do that, to it just being me here. And I noticed at Con Carolinas, and I'd be curious to know whether Patrick and Emily felt kind of the same thing, is that being among people was really freaking weird. It's like I was in the con space and everything was fine. It was like it always is at a con. It's like nothing had ever happened. And I would be sitting there thinking, this is so weird, because there are all these people. And I'd lost the ability to tune out ambient noise. I couldn't hear what people were saying. There's nothing wrong with my hearing. I hear as well as I ever did. But that knack of, in a big group, like at a convention, of hearing what the person in front of you is saying and not having it lost in the people 6 and 8 and 10 feet away in their conversation, I've lost that skill. So I'm going to have to get it back. I'm looking forward to getting it back, but it was not something that I expected to be an issue, and lo and behold, it was.
Patrick?
Yeah, I agree. It was weird. Being around people was like, everybody stay away, stay away. You know, the one thing I didn't really connect with, my writing schedule is usually 7 to 9, Monday through Friday, and then whatever I don't do during the week, I do on the weekends, because I work full time during the day. But, you know, the one thing I really didn't understand until the whole mess started was that going to the conventions and being around all these amazing writers, like, you know, people on the, you know, call here tonight, that really energizes me. Just that, just being able to sit with your peers and just realize what an amazing group of authors that your friends are with. You know, it's like, you know, you pick up somebody's book and you read it and you go, that's amazing. And it's like, oh yeah, and they're like really good people and they're like friends of mine, you know. Having people come up to the table and just talking about books or movies or whatever, you know, just that kind of interaction, you know, because you know, it's like, I want to have more stuff on my table to sell. I want to, you know, have more books for people to read, you know, and without that constant, you know, during con season, it's every 3-4 weeks, we've got a convention, we spend the weekend, everybody, you know, does their thing. But that is really inspiring and motivating to be in that environment. And when that wasn't around, I think that was part of my struggles, was just, I can, spend 50 hours writing, this book and get it out the door, and okay, I'm not going to conventions to hawk it. I'm not, and you can only do so much marketing. So, and you just don't get the feedback. So that was really the biggest blow to mine. And now I'm headed back to the office next week. So I'll be getting back to my normal 7 to 9 writing slot probably more often, because I'll have that division between work and, because right now, my work computer's right there. So every time it bings, I get up and go over, which isn't helpful when you're trying to write.
All right. So one final question, and I'll start with you, Nancy. What are you going to be doing now that this story's out?
Working on the next one. I have a new series coming from Falstaff Books, which is historical, which means diving back into the research pool again. And so I'm working on that. And then I have another another Arachnid Files story to work on. And, I'm sure any writer will tell you there's always another book in the queue waiting for its turn. So that's pretty much it.
All right, Patrick.
I am working on the second of the Watchers series, which is tentatively called Potions and Pistols. I've also got, my agent is shopping the Cyberpunk Fairy book, and I'm editing a Witches of Asheville novel that is going to get shopped soon. And I'm in an anthology this summer at some point about Fae traditions in modern cinema.
All right, Emily.
Well, later this year in September, the third book in my Ice Fund Chronicles series, which is a modern fairy story, comes out Trader Spring. So I'll be getting ready to do promotion for that. Right now, we're working on book 4, which is tentatively called Summer Regent, which I think is going to be the title. The third book in the Marie series, The Lay of the Black Wolf, is actually in, I think, copy edits or proofs right now. So that one, I'm hoping will be out, both are from Falstaff. I'm hoping will be out before the end of the year. And so pretty soon I have to start writing the 4th one, which should finish out the story arc of the 4 together. So that's what I'm doing in terms of stuff that I know people are going to hopefully pay me for. And then I'm also working on a urban fantasy set in Raleigh that centers on Millie, who is a 72-year-old retired family law attorney who has always had witchy powers, but has sort of, since she was a girl, pretended she didn't. And now sort of some things that happened to her when she was younger are coming home to roost, and she has to cope with them in that way. So, because somebody said, why is it always a young person that's the chosen one? There should be an older person. So I'm basing it on my dad and stepmom, who are both retired lawyers, and my stepmom is a retired family law attorney. So,
all right, perfect. So that'll do it for the panel. I want to thank all of you for joining us. But before we go, let's go around again. Let people know where they can find you. And I'll start with you, Patrick.
I am at patrickdugan.net is my website. I am on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you go out to my website, you can sign up for my newsletter, which will get you pictures of my cute dog and updates on all my book news and convention going on and so forth.
All right, Emily.
Yeah, what Patrick said, except it's emilylavinleverett.com, where you can find my newsletter. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you get a free story that you can't get anywhere else. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. In a couple weeks, not this weekend, but next weekend, I'll be at JordanCon in Atlanta. And so if you're going to that, do find me and say hello. I have the benefit of having a fairly unique name. So if you Google me, I am one of the top people, especially if you include my middle name. If you use Emily Lavin Leverett, there are not a whole lot of us out there. It's a dubious benefit, which means, yay, people can find me, and oh my God, people can find me. So I'm not that hard to find, but that's pretty much where you can can find my stuff.
All right, perfect. Finally, Nancy.
My website is nancynorthcott.com. I have a Facebook page that's Nancy Northcott Author that I'm trying to be better about posting on, but I'm not real good about it. And I'm on Twitter where I'm at Nancy Northcott, and I spend way more time there than is probably good for me. And I also have a newsletter that comes out irregularly when I have something to say or announce.
All right. Again, thanks for joining us, and thank you for watching. See you next time.